All right, so today in statistics, chapter 2, still, we're working with descriptive statistics. In particular, we're playing around with samples, and anytime we make a calculation based on a sample, that's called a statistic. So the statistic has a more specific meaning. I'm going to list out the statistics that we've looked at and that we're going to look at today. So the simplest one, and again, it's a pretty important one, is the sample size. We usually give that the letter N. Sometimes it might just be called the count for the data set. We played around with categorical data, and with categorical data, we had counts of individual subcategories like male, female, eye color, and so on. And then we could play with a proportion. So we have this thing called p hat, which is a sample proportion. We worked on that last week. And this week we moved on to the idea of a sample mean. That's called X with a bar over it. And we compared the sample mean to M, the sample median. And when averages are thrown around in the news, they're talking about either the mean or the median. It kind of depends. More often it's the mean than the median, but sometimes it could be the median. The difference between these, this would be the sum of all of the values of the variable divided by the count. Sometimes it's written a little more formal notation. This Greek sigma, you might have seen that in a spreadsheet, of all the X values divided by the count. And the median is just the middle number when they're in order. Now there's not always a middle number because there could be an even amount of numbers, and we have to average those middle numbers. And if the data is symmetric, then these should be pretty close to the same. But if the data is skewed, then the mean will be dragged away from the median based on the skew. We'll look at that some more today. We looked at it a little bit last class. So these are all things we've looked at before. Today, we're going to be focusing on, we've got to always have that count for any statistic we have. And then we're going to continue to work with the mean and the median. New one today is S, which is the sample standard deviation. Its formula is pretty complicated. I'll go over it in a little bit, but the way to think about it, it's the average spread of the data from the mean. Okay, so when you measure numbers, right, they're not always average. Some people are above average and some people are below average, and they could be really far from average or really close to average. And the sample standard deviation tries to put that all together into a single number. So the sample standard deviation is an average spread from the mean. So in order to do standard deviation, we gotta have the mean, not the median, the mean. And we'll take a look at that more specifically in a moment. So these two, again, are linked with each other. We're then gonna jump into percentiles. And a percentile is just a line you draw in the data that says some percent is below. For example, the median is the 50th percentile. It marks the place where 50% of the data is at or below that point. Other percentiles we're going to look at are the minimum. That's the place where 0% is below. Whoops, sorry, 59. We're going to look at what's called Quartile One. We got the median in the middle. And then Quartile 3. And then the maximum. So I'm just going to write these down a couple of different ways. The minimum can be considered to be quartile 0. And we got to distinguish the word quartile versus quarter. I'll talk more about that later. Quartile is a position that marks the end or beginning of a quarter, usually the end of a quarter. So Q0 means there's nothing below, 0 below. We could also call that P0 for the 0 percentile, which means 0% is below that point. Quartile 1 is abbreviated Q with a 1. Usually it's subscripted, but it could be just next to it. And that would be the 25th percentile, P25. So 25% of the data is at or below that point. So if somebody says, hey, in that mountain bike race you did, you were right at Q1. That means 25% of the other riders were slower than me, or I was faster than the first 25% of riders. Median would be Q2, the second quarter. It marks the place where the second is. So that would be the 50th percentile. And then Q3, quartile 3, would be the 75th percentile. And then the max, we could consider to be the 4th quartile. It marks the end of the 4th quarter. It's 100% of the data is at or below that point. So we could also call it P100. And then we're going to take these 5 numbers here. This is known as the 5-number summary. And we're going to graph it as a box plot. I'm going to compare it to histograms that we make. And then see what that says about the data. So this is all that we're doing today. So the first half of class is mainly going to be focusing on the reviewing the mean and the median and throwing in the standard deviation into that. So let's get busy with some numbers.